So briefly, I will present what is Spirit Change and the concept of the share and learn. And then after that, I will let Amy and Jacqueline take the lead. So can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes.
Excellent. So the agenda, briefly, the session will last about 2 hours. So we will have the presentation of the agenda that I'm doing right now, the introduction of Spirit Change and SCIC, and then the discussion on gender equality and equity, and then wrap up and next steps. So quickly, the Spirit Change program, for those who don't know, is a 5-year initiative funded by Global Affairs Canada that aims to increase the engagement of Canadian SMOs in international development and increase the engagement of Canadians, particularly youth, as global citizens in support of the FEAP and the SDGs. So one of the outcomes of the program is to increase the capacity of educators, such as yourselves, to engage youth as effective global citizens and advocates of gender equality and the SDGs that can be reached through educator-focused workshops conducted to improve teachers' abilities to engage youth as global citizens. And in this mindset that the Share and Learn series was born. So it's the Share and Learn series, it's at least 3 events per year that aim to create learning, sharing, and networking opportunities for primary and secondary schools teachers. And with these events, educators will share and learn pedagogical resources with peers and experts in order to engage youth as effective global citizens and advocates the Sustainable Development Goals, so SDGs, and gender equality. So each session will be hosted by one council. So this one is hosted by Saskatchewan. And we'll invite teachers to present topics related to SDGs and gender equality and tools that they actually use in the classroom to engage youth as effective global citizens. So the goal is really to share a peer-to-peer learning. So what tools do we actually use in the classroom and share it with fellow educators? So it's really a share and learn opportunity. Just in terms of logistics, especially because we have a simultaneous interpretation, as you know, the session will be recorded, but it will be important to keep your microphone turned off, except, of course, during breakout group activities or if you want to ask a question, and avoid sound distractions to ensure that the simultaneous interpretation works smoothly. Please use the raise your hand feature if you want to intervene or ask a question, or use the chat box also if you have questions or comments. And of course, I will repeat it, but if you can turn on your camera, we really like and appreciate to see you, and it's more fun for Jacqueline, who will want to have you participate in the session. So as I mentioned, the facilitation team today, so it's Amy Bosch, from the host from SCIC, and Jacqueline Roach, who will be the teacher and facilitator. And if you have any questions during or after the session, please contact Amy Bosch or myself, and we will ensure to answer them. So there you go. I'm trying to get out of my screen. Okay, good. Maybe also one more thing before I let the floor to Amy and Jacqueline is I would do a small acknowledgement, because we would like to begin by acknowledging that since we are all from different parts of the country and even the world, as we now know, we are all in different unceded territories. So personally, I would like to acknowledge that I'm currently on the traditional and unceded territory of the Abenaki people and the Wabanaki Confederacy. And do not hesitate to share in the chat the land that you are in right now. So thanks, and enjoy the session.
Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome. We're so happy to have you here this evening. I'm just going to take a couple minutes of your time to introduce SCIC and the work that we do at our council. Before that, I want to start off our time together acknowledging the lands that Jacqueline and I live and work on. The purpose of a land acknowledgement is to start in a good way and recognize the land and its importance to our lives. In Saskatchewan, we are on treaty land. These treaties serve to govern our relationship with Indigenous peoples. In Regina, we are on Treaty 4 territory, which is the traditional territory of the Nehiyawak, Nakaway, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota peoples, and the traditional homeland of the Métis. It is important that we recognize that we all have benefits and responsibilities under these agreements. We must move beyond acknowledgement to building relationships. We must commit to learning and decolonizing our minds and lives. We dedicate our efforts to working together in a spirit of collaboration and reconciliation. We are all treaty people. So, the Saskatchewan Council for International Cooperation builds momentum towards a just, equitable, and sustainable world by enhancing the capacity of its members, educating and inspiring the public to take action on global issues, and creating connections among those we serve. We were formed in 1974 in Regina by international development and emergency relief agencies active in Saskatchewan. So we've been around for a few years. So what do we do at the council? We work with mainly 3 groups of people. Our members, who are civil society and nonprofit organizations, whom we work with to increase capacity and strengthen partnerships. We work with youth, who we connect with through skills-based workshops, collaborative leadership and empowerment programming, and educators to bring global citizenship education and the sustainable development goals to the classroom. Our aim is to inspire action towards the awareness and achievement of the SDGs through our members, youth, and educators by making the local to global connections. So, global citizenship education. I am the education program coordinator with SCIC. I support the work of K-12 educators as well as post-secondary educators in Saskatchewan by providing opportunities and resources for them and their students to engage in global citizenship education and the SDGs. Recognizing that teachers have the potential to catalyze their students and their wider community to engage in the achievement of the SDGs, I offer professional development opportunities, in-class workshops, and spaces for sharing best practices and resources, just like we're doing here tonight. So now I'd like to introduce you to our teacher facilitator, Jacqueline. I just want you to all know that you are really in for a treat tonight with her session. Jacqueline works for Regina Public Schools as a high school ELA teacher and is passionate about teaching for change. The focus in her classroom is on building relationships, creating a brave space, and leading with empathy. Using anti-racist and anti-oppressive resources, Jacqueline works with her students to see the world in different ways and recognize what their role is in making it a better place. She loves to work with other educators who care about social justice, and she looks forward to seeing what the next generation is capable of. We are so happy to have you, Jacqueline, so take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Amy. Hello, everybody. I'm really excited to be here tonight. I'm excited to see some familiar faces and to see other faces. Maybe a couple of you want to, I don't know, turn on your camera and peek out a little bit there. Say hello. So I'm Jacqueline. I'm a teacher, a high school ELA teacher. And right now I teach grade 9, grade 11, and grade 12. So I've been teaching on and off for about 10 years. And I took some time away from teaching when my babies were little, ran a business from home. And actually was very hesitant to get back into teaching afterwards. And it actually happened because we looked at the bank account. My husband's like, we're broke, you need to go back to work. And I came back to work begrudgingly, didn't want to do it. But I'm so grateful that I did. It was the best decision for me and my family. And I was able to find my passion in teaching again. I'm passionate about making my students actively engaged citizens. I try my best to lead with love, stay humble, and question myself in my practices constantly so that I can be improving. While I'm talking, I encourage you to ask questions. So feel free to ask in the chat or just put your hand up on your screen and I can stop and you can ask. And I do encourage you to turn your cameras on if you are able to. So teaching gender equality in the K-12 classroom. So in addition to Amy's land acknowledgement and Marie Catherine's actually, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the land that I am currently living on. I live on Treaty 4 territory in Saskatchewan, so it is not unceded, it is treaty territory. And it's the traditional lands of the Nehiyawak, the Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis. I am grateful to the Indigenous peoples who lived here prior to colonization and for the ones who continue to teach and care for our land and nurture the spirit in our province. I also would like to acknowledge the incredible Indigenous matriarchs that have led their communities to the end of the world and back again. And I want to honor the feminine spirit that lives here. So to begin, I kind of want to talk a little bit about pronouns. So as a cisgender person, meaning my pronouns match the sex I was assigned to at birth, I have the privilege of often not thinking about my pronouns. But by acknowledging my pronouns in spaces where other people exist, I'm creating space for others to acknowledge their own pronouns if they don't align with what they were assigned. It's an easy way to show that I'm an accomplice to the LGBTQIA+ community, and an easy way to create inclusivity in my space. So in my classroom, I always start my year with banners, a banner activity where students put their names, they put their pronouns, and then other things about themselves. So if you are able to, I see most people have been able to already to change their or add their pronouns to their name on their screen, that would be excellent. You just have to click on those 3 little dots on your little thumbnail and you should be able to rename yourself there. And in the module that SCIC is providing you all with, the gender equity module, page 33 has gender identity terms on it. So a lot of great information if you're unfamiliar with the different gender identity terms and how that applies to students in the classroom. So these are just some examples of what those pronoun banners look like, or the banners. So they have a little bit of information about the student, their name, things they like to do, and then they always add their pronouns onto them. And these are displayed around my classroom. So it's an awesome activity at the beginning of the year because they're beautiful and they just like fill my space with gorgeous student work right off the bat. And they're a great way to get to know kids. So what I usually do is I'll spend that first day or first couple of days, we'll work on the banners and I'll move around the classroom and check in with kids and find out what they're putting on theirs, what's important to them, that kind of stuff. And in the resource packet that you're going to be given after the presentation, I've put a blank version of this assignment in there so that you can see how I would kind of facilitate that. I also start my year by inviting my students to a brave space. So we discuss the idea of a safe space, and I have a video and a reflection that I get them to do. But for time's sake today, I'm just going to skim what that is all about. And I just want to, I guess, to say what the video is. It's basically saying that no space is inherently safe. We all come with different histories, baggage, amounts of money in our pockets, colors on our skin, genders in our hearts. But so because of that, we aren't inherently safe in any space, but we can be brave. We can cultivate rooms where students feel they can be themselves, take risks, know that they'll be picked up after they fall, and know that mistakes are okay. So I'm just going to read this poem to you. This is an invitation to brave space by Mickey Scott Bay Jones. You will also be getting a copy of this in your resource packet. Together, we will create a brave space because there is no such thing as a safe space. We exist in the real world. We all carry scars and we have all caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. This space will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our brave space together, and we will work on it side by side. So as I go through the semester, I often refer back to this and remind them, this is a brave space. If you make a mistake, that's okay. I know it feels uncomfortable, but you are brave and you can do it. And by creating this space, it gives students who maybe are a lot more quiet, more opportunity to speak and I talk about that like hot minute of courage in our stomach where we feel sick, like we're gonna present and we feel like we wanna throw up, but all it takes is that like hot minute, get started, and then we're good to go. And so we talk a lot about bravery in my classroom space. In Saskatchewan, we use the language of outcomes in our curriculums. So I always share outcomes with students and I work really hard to use I can language. And so the outcomes for this session are I can use my own pronouns and understand the importance of sharing them with others. I have strategies for how to teach gender equity or equality in my own classroom. I can define gender. I can determine whether a resource is a good choice for teaching gender equality or not. I see the importance of feminism and why I need to bring it into my classroom. I'm aware of the modules available through SCIC and how they can be used in my classroom. I know the difference between equality and equity. I know that my gender is intersectional with other parts of my identity, and they all work together to provide me with or take away privilege. And I understand why teaching through the lens of gender equity is an important step towards having gender equality. So to start, I think there's just a few basic things we need to know. What is gender? So gender refers to the socially constructed roles, behaviors, expressions, and identities of girls, women, boys, men, and gender diverse people. It influences how people perceive themselves and each other, how they act and interact, and the distribution of power and resources in society. Gender identity is not confined to a binary, girl, woman, boy, man, nor is it static. It exists along a continuum and it can change over time. There's a considerable diversity in how individuals and groups understand, experience, and express gender through the roles they take on and the expectations placed on them. Relations with others in the complex ways that gender is institutionalized in society. So as you can see with the gender unicorn, we see that we have gender identity, gender expression, the sex assigned at birth, who you're physically attracted to, and who you're emotionally attracted to. And this is all part of that continuum and spectrum of what it means, what gender is, and how we all kind of fit somewhere along the spectrum. It's confusing, particularly if you're a cisgender person. So remember, somebody whose sex matches who you identify as, and it can get really confusing, but I think it's really important to remember that even if we feel confused about it, it's so important that we honor the kids who walk into our rooms and honor who they come as. We also need to recognize that women and gender studies scholars are not rooted in gender ideology. So they think about gender as a frame of analysis for understanding the way in which the world works. So I like to think of it as like the lens we look at the world through. I put on my gender glasses because I'm looking at the world through the lens of gender. I think if there's any ideology that has been manifest in this debate, it's the right-wing ideology that's attempting to return to heteronormative patriarchal society. So typically those who don't embrace this frame of thinking, this idea of looking at the world through gender, are doing so because they think things are fine the way that they are, or fine doing things the way we've always done them, right? But we know better. We know that we can change and we know we need to. So a quick little history lesson on our lovely friend, the patriarchy, not friend at all, but historically, as cisgender people who are not trans, so cisgender men began to rule the majority of societies worldwide. Women and girls had less autonomy. They had no ability to make choices for themselves. These societies, the one that we live in, are known as patriarchal human social systems, where men whose gender identity matches the one they were assigned at birth hold primary control, power, property, and leadership. So it's interesting when I talk to kids about this because they think, oh, well, we've made so many advancements, we've come so far, which is true. In a lot of ways we have. But when you look at a picture of all of the premiers of provinces in Canada, 12 out of 13 of them are white men. So clearly there's still a system of patriarchy where those men, cisgender men, hold that primary power and control in the way that our country is governed. So what I'm going to get to, before we get into some of these discussions, I want to take a minute to consider the difference between gender equality and gender equity, because often the terms kind of get tossed around interchangeably, but they're actually quite different, and it's an important distinction to make. So what I would like you to do is take a moment to click on the link that Marie Catherine is going to put in the chat, or you can use your phone if you're on your computer. You can use your phone for the QR code at the bottom, and go on to the Jamboard. So once you're on Jamboard, you're going to post a sticky note, and I want you to just put, what is equality to you? What does that mean? And what is equity on the next slide? So just as a side note too, the QR code that I have on here was made by Google Chrome. So I don't know if you know this, but if you're using Google Chrome and you go to your address bar, I think you guys can see my address bar right now, and you click on this little symbol right here, it'll create a QR code for you on whatever web page you're on. I use QR codes a ton in my classroom, and I just realized I could do that in the last month, and before that I was doing it a very complicated way. So just as a side tip. So if you can head over to the Jamboard, I'm going to share that screen right away and just add your definition of equity and equality. So off to the left, you'll see there's a pen, eraser, sticky note. A sticky note is usually how I do it. Then you can just drag it somewhere on there. So there's two screens there. There's the first board, which is the equality board, and the second board, which is equity. So you can add your thoughts on what they each are. Let me just move some of these off there. Sorry if I got in the way of somebody trying to move theirs.
I don't know how to move mine. I've never used Jamboard on my phone before. I did the equal rights and freedoms on the wrong thing. Are you able to move that one for me, please?
Maybe. I don't know if I can move
Or
it to
if not,
another
I can
board.
delete it. I can't seem to even figure out how to delete it. I've never used this on my phone before, sorry.
I don't know. I've never used it on my phone before either, to be honest.
I opened mine another browse, but like,
Yeah, that's okay. If it doesn't quite work, that's okay. Jamboard is also an awesome tool to use in the classroom. It's a great way to get students to share ideas in more of an anonymous way. You can see names if somebody's snoopy enough to click on things, but I use it similarly to how I would use like Post-its on the whiteboard, things like that. I used it a lot when we were put online last year, and I taught online for a few months, and we used Jamboard a lot. So it's a great tool. Even if we can't quite figure it out today, that's okay. Some of the things I'm seeing are equality is sameness, equal treatment. Equity is different than equality in that it takes into account privilege, circumstances, and relative disadvantages. I am not even going to attempt to read that French one. That can be up to you. That's not my thing. Equity equals the right to the same level of access to resources. If we look at equity, treating people differently because they aren't all starting at the same place, being acknowledged for who you are and what your unique needs are. Yeah, I think those are all really great.
Jacqueline, did you want me to read the French ones maybe?
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
So for equality, on a l'égalité, c'est de mettre au même niveau deux choses sans tenir compte des besoins spéciaux de l'autre. So, vous avez la traduction, alors que l'équité n'a pas de barrière, on doit tenir compte des besoins spéciaux des autres. Et je pense que dans l'équité, on a tendre vers un respect de l'injustice.
Awesome, thank you. Perfect. So yeah, we're all kind of headed in the right direction here. I'm going to equal equals the same wages, same rights, same freedoms. Exactly. So if I go back to my presentation, how does this all apply to gender? So this image that I have up here, are you seeing the equality and equity image, just to confirm? Okay, perfect. It comes from this book called This Book is Feminist by Jamia Wilson. And this book is an awesome primer on feminism. So it's written for teenagers, but I think it's super accessible to anybody. I highly recommend this book if you're new to the idea of, I don't know, the history of feminism, intersectional feminism, and what that looks like. So equality means giving everyone the same opportunities, treatment, and support. So these boxes are an example of equality. All three people are given the same box to view the scenery, but can all three people see the same thing? Who's left out? Who sees the most? Who's shortchanged? Equity is about giving people what they need in order to make things fair and equal. So based on circumstances, it gives more to those who need it and less to those who don't, so they can reach their potential. By giving different sized and shaped boxes, everyone can see the view. Equity and working on equity is how we move to equality, okay? Becoming equal in a true sense really relies on equity and learning what people need to be successful. Gender equity is necessary for true gender equality to occur. It is presumptuous to assume that everyone will have equality just by starting out on the same line without adequate supports to reach the finish line. Excuse me. In essence, gender equality is equal opportunity and gender equity is equal outcome. I would also like to add that until we live, a quotation from this book is feminist, until we exist in a world where transgender and gender nonconforming people can live and thrive, none of us are truly free. So Lila Watson is an Indigenous Australian who's heavily involved in Indigenous rights there, and she's a champion for women's rights. And she said, if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. So I don't she's saying she doesn't want you to come and give her the box, right? She doesn't want your assistance in the way that you provide for everybody else. But if you've come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. Okay, we can't come in and try to save the situation or be the ones who fix it. The reality is if we want it to truly be fixed, we all need to know that it matters to us individually. So Lila Watson is a champion. How would you define a champion? This is an activity that comes from the SCIC module. But again, for time's sake, I'm just kind of going to give the definition in your classroom. There's so many great ideas for how to do vocabulary assignments like this. And for time's sake, I'm just going to share it. So a champion is a person who enthusiastically supports, defends, or fights for a person, belief, right, or principle. So a champion is somebody who says, it isn't enough to say, well, I'm not biased. I don't have gender bias. You have to be actively working against it if we want to see change. So an example of this is she has long been a champion of prisoners' rights or the disabled or free speech. Okay, or Lila Watson is a champion for Indigenous rights in Australia. So we're going to watch a video here, and it's also part of the lesson that's available in the module. So after watching the video, we're going to head into some breakout rooms, and there's going to be some prompts there for you. So the purpose of this lesson is to get students thinking about what gender equality is and what some of the things are that are standing in our way of gender equality. So I had it set up to play on here, but I wanted to be able to add the French translation in. So I'm just going to change the screen that I'm sharing, and it should work. Can we hear?
We cannot hear. We can see the translation, but we cannot hear. When you share your screen, did you click on share with sound? I think there's this option.
You can't hear it?
There's share with the sound.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
You did it?
I'm
Okay.
sure. Oh, there we go.
Then maybe.
Let's try it again. Technological
Yes.
difficulties. Okay.
The message is
That's
clear.
good.
Perfect.
People around the world are standing up for gender equality. We've seen it in the Me Too, Time's Up, and She Decides movements. We've seen it in the streets, in Hollywood, and around the world. Now, in the year that Nelson Mandela would have turned 100, we're turning this movement into action. We're challenging global citizens to raise their voices together to demand that world leaders take concrete actions to achieve gender equality by 2030. Because we know that when girls and women are empowered, when she is equal, she can get an education, decide when to get married and start a family, and get proper healthcare. The She is Equal campaign is rooted in the legacy of great leaders and advocates like Nelson Mandela. Mandela believed, above all, that if half of us are held back, then no one can move forward. She is Equal will carry Mandela's message of activism to promote policies and investments that raise up and empower women and girls by 1. Eliminating the barriers that prevent girls and women from equal protection under the law, having agency over their sexual and reproductive health, and fully engaging in the economy. 2. Promote access to clean water, sanitation, and menstrual hygiene resources for girls and women, so that they can gain an education and remain healthy and empowered. 3. Promoting access to quality nutrition for adolescent girls. 4. Ensuring access to essential medicines and healthcare to prevent, control, and eliminate neglected tropical diseases, which affect and stigmatize the most marginalized girls and women. 5. Making sure all girls have access to a quality education. Together, we can be the generation to ensure that she is equal.
All right. So after watching that, what you're going to do is go into a small group, into a breakout room. Marie Catherine is going to move us into those. Once you're in the breakout room, there's going to be, we're going to put a link to a document right away. And this document is where you're going to record some of your responses. So what I would like to see ideally is that somebody who either has a second screen or is able to type and manage their screen that way to do some of the typing for the group. So the first question is asking, after you watched that video, I want you to think about whether gender equality or equity exists in Canada. Why or why not? So don't spend too long on it, but just kind of to get you started. What do you think needs to change in order for true gender equity and equality in Canada? And then below, there's a table for each group to type into, but there's the 5 issues that were discussed in the video. I'd like you to start by putting some examples of where we see these things in Canada. So where we see barriers, where we see lack of access to clean water, lack of quality nutrition, lack of access to medicine and healthcare, and lack of access to education. And then maybe some teaching ideas for helping students understand these issues. So please include the grade if you put a teaching idea down. And if you don't get to the teaching idea part and you just get to the discussion, that's also okay. So whenever we're going to have about 15 minutes for this discussion and idea sharing, and you'll be automatically brought back into the main group after those 15 minutes are up. So whenever you're ready, Marie Catherine, you can divide us up. So I know 15 minutes goes by so fast, especially when it takes a few minutes to kind of get the conversation going and get started. This document will be available to you after the presentation. So if you have any ideas or things you want to add to it, that would be awesome. Any teaching ideas or, you know, websites, resources that you love, that would be excellent. But for time's sake, I don't want to keep you here all night. So we're going to move on past this one. But this idea of championing gender equity as a global citizen, I think by acknowledging these 5 issues and saying, you know, these are the things that need to happen in order for us to have gender equity or gender equality in Canada, those are a great starting point for our students too, right? So looking, if you're wanting to teach about this, those are a great place to start. Start with talking about what eliminating barriers looks like. What does it look like to educate girls around the world? Those kinds of things, just kind of as a, almost like a checklist to say, these are the things we'll talk about as a class. One thing I heard come up actually in a couple of the rooms, I kind of bounced around while you were all talking. One of the things I heard come up was this idea of our multiple identities. We are more than just our gender. There are more things that impact the way we engage in the world. So when discussing gender equality, it isn't enough to say that we want men and women to be equal. We all have different identities that also impact that experience, and all of our identities are intersectional with one another. If you have a piece of paper in front of you, feel free to pull it out, put your name in the middle. If you don't, this is totally an activity you can do on your own after. But I'm going to show you what my identity map looks like. This is an excellent activity for kids of any age. I do this with my high school students. I always tell them that I prefer to do my brainstorms in this web model, but they can do brainstorms however they want to, whatever that looks like. So on my identity map, I am a lot of things outside of just being a woman. So I am female. I am stubborn. I am cisgendered. I'm optimistic. I am a creator, an English speaker. I'm tall and large-bodied. I'm a leggings lover. Anybody else with me? I am the great granddaughter of a settler. I'm a daughter. I am, oh my goodness, where to go? I'm a glasses wearer. I'm a reader, a candy fan. I'm an oldest sister. I am caring. I'm a mother. I'm white. I'm brunette. I struggle with my mental health. And all of these things come together to create this web of who I am and how I bring myself to the world. I am all of these things, and they all impact how I show up in the world. And this is called intersectionality. So for intersectionality, we're going to watch this just little video, and it's kind of like a primer on what intersectionality is. So I am just going to, oh, I didn't do the sound thing again, did I? It didn't work. Share the sound. Okay.
Heard this word before? Even if you have, you might not know what it means. Let's take a look at it. The first part's easy enough. Intersection, a place where things come together. Intersectionality refers to the reality that we all have multiple identities that intersect to make us who we are. It also gives us a way to talk about oppressions and privileges that overlap and reinforce each other. This term dates back to the 1980s and legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. She noticed that we didn't have an effective way to talk about how the experiences of Black women are different from the experiences of Black men and of white women. How? Black women endure both gender discrimination and racial discrimination. Over the last 30 years, scholars, educators, and activists have expanded the use of the word intersectionality to talk about identities beyond race and gender. Let's look at a few examples. Jerry has a disability, and his family lives below the poverty line. He is the oldest of 10, which requires him to do a lot of caregiving and sometimes keeps him out of school. No one in the school counseling office has talked to Jerry or his parents about his plans for after graduation. He has applied for several jobs, but never gets called back. Fatima is Muslim and recently came to the United States from Somalia. She finds that many people at her school make assumptions about her values and abilities before they speak to her. Many of her classmates think she shouldn't be at their school at all. Greta comes from an affluent family. Both her parents and grandparents went to college, and her father owns a successful business. She doesn't think about her identity very often, but she does think of herself as someone who will go to college and get a good job once she graduates. Think about Greta's situation as opposed to Fatima's or Jerry's. Fatima and Jerry are members of marginalized groups. They don't get to choose whether or not to think about their identities. Greta, on the other hand, can ignore intersectionality if she wants to. Life isn't the same for everyone, even for people who share identity characteristics. By adopting an intersectional lens, we have a better opportunity to understand why and to change the institutions that help and harm us based on who we are. Want to learn more? Read.
Oopsies.
Intersection.
Okay, Audre Lorde said there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. And this is exactly what intersectionality is about. So we're here talking about gender equity and gender equality in the classroom, but that doesn't stand alone as an issue. All of these issues intertwine and work together. And it's important that we think about our students in this intersectional way if we want to address gender as an issue. So I encourage you to think about the way you look at the world. Is it through an intersectionality lens? So, or do you see people as a monolith? So are your students Indigenous? Are they girls? Are they jokesters or leaders? Or are they all of those things wrapped up into one? And by looking at the world through an intersectionality lens, we can see that gender equality is about so much more than just gender and women and boys and girls as dichotomies attempting to be equal. A really important part of acknowledging intersectionality is acknowledging our own power and privilege we come into situations with. This is about more than just gender and race, and all parts of us carry some sort of power and privilege or lack thereof. So if you're new to the idea of privilege, particularly in terms of gender and race, there's a supplemental resources package that has a few ideas in it, but one of the most popular is always the Unpacking the Backpack of White Privilege. It's a great example, a great thing to read if you're new to this idea. And so there are a lot of things on this wheel that I'm presenting that influence how we show up in the world. So you can see that closer to the center of the wheel is where power is held. And the further you get away from it, the less power. So some of the categories you can think about in terms of this are neurodiversity, sexuality, mental health, language, gender, citizenship. Depending on situations, these all hold some level of power or lack of power. And you could add to that skin color, formal education, our ability, our wealth, our housing, our body size. Another thing that the creator of this wheel would like to add to this wheel, but didn't, just because it completely depends on where you are in the world, is religion. There is power in religion as well, and but it's not necessarily included in the wheel just because that power varies so much around the world. So this is my wheel of power and privilege. This is what mine looks like. So this means that I actually have a lot of power in a lot of areas of my life. Having power, and this is something I talk with my students about, having power and being in the middle of that circle isn't the problem, right? I don't hate white, cisgender, rich, slim men, okay, who are Canadian citizens. I just recognize that their privileges allow them power in this world. And I encourage them and you to use any pieces of power you have to make a difference for those people on the outside of this circle. So this wheel is actually an activity I do with students after we've discussed what privilege is. We talk about how the dominant culture is inside of this box. So if we're thinking about the circle, the middle of that circle, dominant culture inside the box, and marginalized voices on the outside. I don't hate the people inside the box. I hate the box itself. That's the system that we're working against, right? That patriarchal system that keeps those people in the box. So we talk a lot about that in my classes, and this lesson actually comes from, well, part of this lesson comes from this book is Anti-Racist. So this is another one by the same artist, different author. And this one came out prior to This Book is Feminist. And this one is, I think, a lot more accessible in a lot of ways. It's got 20 lessons. It says 20 lessons on how to wake up, take action, and do the work. And this book is actually $8 this month with Scholastic. So it's a great time to go buy it if you're interested in it. So again, we have to think about that intersectionality and how that impacts things. In education, in terms of gender, biases run deep in our systems, whether in terms of participation, textbooks, or teachers' attitudes. And I think there were a couple things that came up in that brainstorming session. But a statistic is that girls are more likely to never enter primary school than boys. Despite all international and national efforts, over half of children out of school are girls. 31 million girls are still out of school around the world. And women are underrepresented in tech and scientific disciplines due to social and cultural obstacles to management and leadership roles. Only 29% of the world's researchers are women. So one thing I saw come up in that discussion was discussing the pay gap. Now in Canada, we can't legally have a pay gap, right? There's laws against what causes pay gap. But the reality is that the roles that women take on in our culture and in our society and the roles that men take on leave less room for women to grow in their careers, less room for women to advance in their fields of work. And that is what creates the pay gap in Canada, okay? So we're gonna talk about this big, scary word for some people, feminism. In its simplest form, feminism is the advocacy of women's rights on the ground of the equality of the sexes. So the reality is that if you've shown up here to this meeting and you want to know more and you want to bring gender equality into your classroom, you are a feminist. So you can go out into the world and say, hey, I'm a proud feminist. You're allowed to do that. It's not the 60s. We're not burning bras and we're not, causing a bunch of, I don't know, men to feel uncomfortable, I suppose. And I think it's so important that we identify as feminists so that we can move this discussion along. Things that we know to be true. Worldwide, men are more likely to earn more than women. Black women and Indigenous women in Canada experience a wage gap in every education level, and the gap is largest for the most educated Black women. 15% of transgender folks live at a poverty rate that is nearly 4 times that of the general population. LGBTQIA+ BIPOC families, so Black, Indigenous, people of color, experience the worst of the disparities. The UK government, this is so interesting, the UK government announced in the 2020 budget that the tampon tax of 5% value added tax would finally be scrapped. Great. But back in 2014, Laura Corrington launched a petition after discovering that Jaffa cakes, crocodile steaks, and private jet maintenance aren't classed by Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs as non-essential luxury items under those rules, but tampons were, that story is just crazy to me. Indigenous American women and Indigenous Canadian women would have similar statistics, only make 58 cents on the dollar compared to white men, for a population of women who are murdered at rates 50 or 10 times the national average. That's reported, 10 times the national average. The pay gap is literally a matter of life and death. Fair property inheritance systems are becoming more commonplace in recent years, but the reality is men tend to own more land and assets than women across the globe. On average, LGBTQIA+ couples raising families make 20% less than heterosexual couples in the United States and are more likely to live in poverty. So if we know all of these things are true, we must be willing to help. We must be willing to make the difference. So whether or not you choose to carry the banner, the feminist wins we benefit from and may even take for granted came to us because someone was willing to stand up, speak up, and make a change. So now what? How do we do this as educators? When we're thinking about ideas, I like to think about it as the same way we think of like truth and reconciliation. There's no reconciliation without truth. We must address the truth of the situation, otherwise students don't see why we need a change. So the first thing that you can do as an educator is examine your own gender biases and those of your students. There are a couple ways to do this. The QR code here takes you to a bias test, and it has a list of like all sorts of biases you can have. And you just do this quick little test and it tells you whether you hold gender bias, racial bias, body size bias, all sorts of things. And I want you to think about what ways do you privilege boys over girls in the classroom, or privilege girls over boys in your classroom? Do boys get away with things in your room because boys will be boys? Are you more actively engaged in the education of your female students because you believe they are more actively engaged in their education? These are all really important things to think about. And this is an implicit bias, right? We don't even realize we have this necessarily. That's why I love the idea of the bias test. So you can kind of see where that falls. So the second thing you can do is remember that gender is non-binary. We all fall somewhere on this spectrum. Male and female are not dichotomous. If we actively engage in the world through this lens, you will begin to notice how your biases affect the way you teach. When we stop seeing our students as part of one group or one other group, we can engage in who they truly are. And I'm here talking to you about this, but this does not mean that I am perfect in my classroom at not having gender bias. I do, and I recognize it and I make a change. So in the moments when I look around and notice that I'm engaging with the boys more because they're funny and they're loud, okay? I often find myself doing that. And then the quiet girls sitting in the back don't get my attention. And I have to actively say to myself, Jacqueline, you need to go talk to this kid today because you've been focusing all your attention on this group of boys, okay? And we often see, you know, maybe groups of people who are acting out and they get a lot of attention. So we have to think about how our gender, and this comes to race too, but how our gender bias impacts the way we engage. And we need to think about gender being non-binary. We must address intersectionality. It's so important to acknowledge our students' entire beings if we want to make real change. There are tons of ideas on the internet if you want to address intersectionality in your classroom at any grade level. I would say, Mila, that continues into high school. I would, like, as a high school teacher, Mila said, I've noticed that situations like that happen more in middle school. Girls are way more quiet usually than the boys. And I would say it follows them into high school for the most part. But addressing intersectionality, there's tons of ideas on the internet. In the resource package that you'll be sent, I've included some websites that I personally love to use for lessons and ideas, and they have tons of things on their websites about intersectionality. And this one to me is probably the most important and the most accessible way of really impacting our students, is thinking about texts as voices that are windows. So who could use this as an opportunity to see through to the identity of others? And mirrors, who could this be a reflection of? When we're choosing texts, this is so important. We're not always in charge of what we have to teach, right? We have a curriculum, like most Canadian provinces, we have our list of things we need to get through in the semester, but we are in charge of how we teach it. So it's so important to choose texts that are representative of your students and texts that aren't. Think about what the texts are saying to the students in the room. What are they saying about white people? What are they saying about Black people, Indigenous people? And I actually just confronted this recently. I was reading one of my students' writing notebooks, and my one course, it's English A30, and here in Saskatchewan, that's mostly Canadian Lit. And I focus heavily on Indigenous content in my Canadian Lit course. And I had one student write in their notebooks, why are all the stories about Indigenous people sad? Why can't there just be normal Indigenous stories? And this is something I have acknowledged myself and thought I need to bring more celebration in, need to bring more of the good pieces, right? But they're right. When we're looking for texts, there's a ton of great, beautiful stories about resilience and overcoming. But we need to be showing kids, well, Indigenous people are actually just real people out in the world, and they have good lives and celebrate and wonderful things going on too, right? So when I'm thinking about choosing texts, I'm also thinking about honoring a whole person, not just one part of an experience. This is, I mean, obviously when I'm talking about ELA, this plays into my text choice a lot, but this is also true in science, in math, in other subject areas, in social studies. Whose view is being represented? Who's missing from the textbook? Whose insight hasn't been brought in? This is a super easy and important way to helping our students gain that gender equality. When you're choosing resources to use in the classroom, think about what are the educational materials or curriculum free from gender stereotypes. So if you're picking a book, are you, I guess, motivating some of those stereotypical beliefs by reading that text with your students? Do the educational materials show females and males in equal measure? And do they treat everyone with respect and potential? And here I would add too, do they address gender as something on a continuum rather than a binary? And do the materials reflect the needs and life experiences of both males and females while promoting peace and equality regardless of identity or background? I think about this a lot in teaching ELA because often I'll hear people say, oh, well, boys don't really like that book. That's more of a book for girls. It has a female protagonist. And I just think to myself, like, of all the books I've read that had male protagonists, and I was just fine reading them, right? And we don't often think about it that way, but it's so important to think about the way that gender is presented in those texts. And by doing these and by thinking about how you're choosing these resources, it's going to make you more aware of how you're handling gender in your classroom. So next time you pick up a textbook or a novel or a picture book, think about, what is this text saying about gender? And is it what I want to teach my kids about gender? So now it's your turn. As you leave this presentation, there are a few things I want you to reflect on. I want you to think about what it means to be a feminist in the classroom. How are you going to bring your feminist beliefs, because all of you are here, you all have feminist beliefs. How are you going to bring those into the classroom in a meaningful way? What could your classrooms look like if we changed this narrative? Okay, if we started to bring in diverse voices, and if we said, we're not just going to read a bunch of old white men. Okay, how could you change the narrative? How can you leave here and grow your commitment to equality? What does it look like after you leave here and go to work tomorrow morning? What could you do that's simple and different, and even something just little that's going to grow that commitment? And how can you show up in ways that bring your values to life, to the classroom, to the staff room, to your home? Okay. And this is one that I struggle with. I find it easy to bring my values into my classroom, into my home. The staff room is a different story. That's a different discussion, right? I love getting together with other educators who have similar ideas and beliefs to me, but the reality is that doesn't always happen in the staff room. It can be a lot harder of a place to bring your ideas. So one way to help with that and sharing ideas with other people is to think about the resources available. So some ways that we can show up for our students is to facilitate learning about the world and global citizenship concerns, just like we're doing here tonight. And the modules from SCIC can really help with that. The gender equity module is actually how I got introduced to SCIC, because I joined a book club and we read a book called The Girl with the Louding Voice. And we used the gender equity module to kind of think of how we might teach that text. And I found the module super accessible. So there's the global citizenship in the classroom. And this module aims to guide students to understand and critique an increasingly interconnected and interrelated world. The goal is that students will develop critical and conscious citizenship skills, become more aware of their personal impact on the world, and explore their roles and responsibilities as global citizens. The Transforming Charity into Solidarity and Justice module was created to address the gap in resources dealing with the issues of charity, justice, and solidarity. So this was the first module that was made. It focuses on increasing knowledge about global issues, building values of empathy and compassion, and equipping students with the skills they need to take action. Understanding power and privilege through anti-oppression addresses the gap in educator resources that deal with power and privilege and that explore the complex global issues facing humanity today. Through that lens, again, putting on those glasses of anti-oppression, anti-racism, decolonization, the root causes of poverty and environmental sustainability. And it focuses on increasing students' understanding of how power and privilege impact people differently. And then the gender equity one that was brought up tonight and some of the examples came from. So I see somebody shared the representation project. I actually just used a film from the representation project. It's available on Canopy through Regina Public Libraries. I'm sure it's available through other people's public libraries too. I used the Mask You Live In film, and it talks about gender and how boys are raised in a certain way and girls are raised in a certain way. And because of it, boys all kind of live behind this mask. And the kids loved it. We watched it over a couple days and they were very engaged in it. We had a good discussion to follow up. Yeah, I highly recommend Representation Project. They do some awesome work. So thank you. All of the resources referred to tonight will be emailed out to you. That'll include that blank wheel of power and privilege. The one that I showed you is one that I made based on the original. So I've included both of those for you to see. There's going to be a recommended reading list, websites for you, a copy of that Brave Space poem. So if you have any questions, now is an awesome time to ask. You can either ask in the chat or turn on your mic and I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you so much. This is my first time presenting at something like this. So I hope that you got something out of it and you leave, as my 4-year-old daughter would say, fired up for tomorrow. So if you have any questions,